Yeah, and so like with what Patrick was talking about, we're very proud of the women or female workers that have been on the Arsenal over time, and so we have here kind of a sampling of pictures, from some of those employees going from, Patrick had mentioned, some of the female employees that were working in the shell filling facility here on during World War I, and these are a picture of the group of women here, but these. The women in World War I, filled out a huge portion of the workforce as far as, like working in shell filling, which was a previously, incredibly dangerous job that, was only previously reserved for men, to leather working, to clerical, like Patrick mentioned, with the stenotype machine and everything. And so these, really highlight a number of jobs that the women did. And like I'd mentioned to you before, Cora de Willefond, she was basically a messenger on post, and so delivering things back and forth to different offices. And she had previously done it on roller skates, and so she became, like this picture shows here, the very first motorcycle rider on post. And so she would ride those messages back and forth, and it was an incredibly important job, just keeping all the offices in contact with each other. But things like that kind of are highlighted. And this is actually out of the original Arsenal record. It was an Arsenal newspaper that would be published, several times a month.
They used to make her go around on skates?
Yeah, well, I think that, originally she was supposed to deliver messages, and she, chose roller skates to speed that up, and then, then became qualified as a motorcycle rider.
How big was that she was able to take over and do motorcycles?
It was a huge leap forward, and so that it was like Patrick had said, it was kind of this breaking the glass ceiling to a certain degree, where it's like, prior to the war, our first female employee was in 1907, and it had only been clerical. You sat in an office and did, and sometimes it was very technical work. They had to be trained on these specific technical positions, but this was something that was just unheard of before this time. Women were out in doing these jobs that were only previously held for men, and so she was very proud of it, and the Arsenal was very proud of her in stepping into this position. And as Patrick said, that during the war we were looking at the manpower that was being drawn to be become soldiers, sailors, Marines going overseas, and we were looking at in 1918 how much that was going to expand. And women were stepping in to fill that role, and from that point on, they never really shrank back. We always had, about 15% or more, from World War I up through World War II.
Wow. The cynics among us would maybe question, why did it take a war for the world to decide that women could do the same, if not the same job as a man?
Yeah, it's you're right, and it's one of those things that. Jobs had always been held for men in that case, and it took the war to show that yes, that women are just equally as capable as men in these cases. And there was a quote from one of the Arsenal commanders saying that war changes a lot of your mindset, and breaking boundaries and showing different ways that we have to reinvent ourselves to be able to produce things that by the demands of the nation, meeting everything that we need to support the war effort. And he said that women were one of those things, or one of those changes that said, that they can do the same work as the men had previously done, and in many cases were more efficient. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of that breaking that boundary that had never been done before, and nobody really even questioned it before that time. Across industry-wide in the United States, mm-hmm. not just within the Arsenal system. And the war showed that this. It's an equal opportunity in that sense, and it change happens slowly, mm-hmm. Over time, unfortunately, sometimes. But World War I really changed that, and created that system that led to that change. And then going from that to World War II, like Patrick had mentioned, the broaching process. And so in Building 68, where they did all the machine gun manufacturing, like Patrick said, about 60 to 70% of that workforce was strictly female, and they're all doing incredibly technical jobs. Making the machine, all the components of the machine gun, And this is showing the broaching bit that makes the rifling in the machine gun barrels.
Oh, wow.
You know, it's an incredible story, and this is another one here showing these are actually they're making the bolts for the machine guns.
Okay.
And during World War II, they were known as women ordnance workers, or WOWs. So you know, everybody kind of had your like Patrick had mentioned the WACs, you know, the Women's Army Corps. The WOWs were basically the arsenal's equivalent of Rosie the Riveter.
Okay.
Where Rosie the Riveter typically was a civilian employee working for a civilian company, you know, shipbuilding, like Kaiser Shipbuilding in Oakland or things like that. These were women working for the Department of War, today's equivalent of Department of Defense, as ordnance workers.
Awesome. Great.
And then I just wanted to point out one other, that this was a really unique story. Mrs. Helen Erickson. So she started in 1918 along with these other women on the post, and she actually works until 1962, celebrating her 25th year during World War II here, as working on the arsenal. But she retires as the public information officer. So like Captain Akenta here is a public affairs officer. She was the lead public affairs officer for the post, for garrison. I'm sorry, for the arsenal, I should say. And you know, that again was the first time a woman had held that role specifically. So,
Wow.
you know,
Just of course continue today, which is incredible.
Yes.
How impactful was it to have a woman in that role at that time?
At that time, it was incredibly impactful. And in that picture, she was actually getting a press award for her work on the arsenal. And you know, it was you know, a dramatic change. You know, not all, you know, jobs had been, you know, broken into fully by women. And so that was the first time that a woman had held that role as the public affairs officer for the arsenal itself. And so, you know, just breaking those boundaries, you know, slowly over time, but still incredibly important. You know, it's anybody can do the job.
Yeah. You know, we're in a room where there's probably an endless amount of paper and documents and things that are being recorded. As you've gone through things over the years, what have you learned about women and the arsenal specifically? What's something that you've learned that you didn't know maybe before starting here?
Yeah, well, you know, I think one of the things that I've learned that has been most interesting is in the shell filling in World War I, that you know, women, you know, were still held to a certain standard that they shouldn't be allowed to do, you know, dangerous jobs, because you know, shell filling was incredibly dangerous. We had explosions in plants across the United States, and that it's fascinating that, you know, when given the opportunity to volunteer, you know, the positions were immediately filled by women. They were all volunteers to come in and do this, and that just how quickly that happened, and then how much they were accepted, saying they were doing a great job. In many cases, they said that they were being more fine work or more precise work than men were doing at the time. And so they had a very low accident rate. There was only one explosion that was known during at the plant at that time, which was unusual for, you know, having such a low accident rate. Yes, here at Rock Island. And so it was just, for me, that kind of stands out, is that, you know, it's like a relatively early time period. And you know, Rock Island Arsenal is known as one of the first government installations where, on large part, women were doing those dangerous jobs.
Wow.
You know.
That's incredible. What are these magazines that I'm seeing up here? Are these?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not.
Yeah. No. These are Rock Island Arsenal records, and so like the record from World War I, where it was more of a newsletter. These were more, you know, officially published newsletters or magazines that, you know, went all throughout World War II.
Okay.
And you know, they highlighted worker stories. This was primarily for the arsenal employees themselves. I mean, in World War II, we had about 16,000 employees in total, and so, you know, getting word out to all the employees was important. But these highlighted, you know, stories of arsenal workers, you know, and so these ones that we pulled out were specifically, or had articles specifically talking about the WOWs, the women ordnance workers on Rock Island.
Right.
You know, highlighting their stories and talking about, you know, the important work that they were doing for the national war effort.
Do you have like a quote from anybody in any of these where they're like, oh, you know, so and so said, I don't know, something impactful?
Yeah, so it was the garrison, or the arsenal commander, Colonel Ramsey, at the time. The quote that I'd said earlier, where he was saying that, you know, war was breaking down all of our mindsets as far as like things that we wouldn't ordinarily think that we were capable of doing, you know, within the arsenal. And he was saying that women were part of that, where they were such a large percentage of the workforce, you know, like Patrick said, 38%, that they were filling everything, you know, that the arsenal was doing. And you know, he basically just said that, and women were a part of that, breaking boundaries and you know, not thinking that prior to the war, that it was something that they would ordinarily be doing.
Awesome. And who are these three ladies here?
Yeah, so these three women are some of the women that worked in the Shell facility during World War I. And like Patrick mentioned about the stenotype machine, where the women had to actually bring their own equipment. These were the required uniforms that the women could wear, or had to wear. And it was one, it was mentioned for modesty, but two, it was because of the work that they were doing. You know, you couldn't have loose-fitting clothing, you know, to get caught in the machinery or things like that. And so these were all the uniforms that the women were wearing for the shell filling. And they were just modeling that uniform. And they had to actually purchase their own uniforms in order to work in the shell facility. Wow. Which was the same across.
Your help, but you have to pay for your clothes, and you have to pay for the materials
yeah.
you need to work.
And it was across the same male or female, that, you know, if you came here to work on the arsenal, you provided your own uniforms.
Okay.
Outside of military.
Got
so.
it. Okay. Is there anything else that you're wanting to mention specifically about the work that you do in archiving and women in history?
Yeah, I think basically just, you know, remembering these sacrifices that people who've come before us have made, you know, whether it be men or women. And in this case, that, you know, the stories of the women on the arsenal, you know, we constantly try to talk, you know, their sacrifices and the boundaries that they broke. But just telling their stories, that we're their voice now. You know, Caleb with the archivist and Patrick at the museum and myself, we're their voices to be able to tell where we came from, and, you know, for good or bad, the boundaries that were broken, you know, and how we got to where we are today.